I recently came across this old official U.S. Navy carrier landing training film. Here's part of it that goes into great detail about pilot techniques.
During your approach to a carrier landing, there are three variables: meatball, line-up, and airspeed. On the downwind leg, trim your aircraft for optimum angle of attack prior to reaching the abeam position. The standard turn for your type of aircraft will bring you into position for the final approach. If your turn is too tight, you will have an angling approach. If your turn is too shallow, you will have an overshooting approach. You should complete your turn on speed, lined up, and at the proper altitude to intercept the meatball. Extending aft from the port side of the ship, the glide slope beam is computer stabilized to correct for pitch and roll of the ship. The start is when you roll your wings level on the glide slope. The first one-third of the approach is referred to as the middle. The second one-third is in the groove. In close is 5 to 10 seconds out. Anything closer is at the ramp. Now let's see and discuss some glide slope corrections. If your approach is high, reduce power to increase rate of descent. As the meatball approaches the center, add sufficient power to reduce rate of descent to optimum. Large power reductions require corresponding large power additions to halt aircraft momentum. So a third intermediate power setting is usually required to maintain optimum glide slope. A high and fast condition must be corrected early in the approach. A large power reduction is necessary. Increase the attitude of the aircraft to decrease airspeed to optimum angle of attack. It is necessary to correct the airspeed first to achieve proper hook-to-eye value, so the pilot is obtaining accurate glide slope information. Maintain optimum angle of attack and proceed as in correcting a high. The possible consequences of the very large power reduction necessary to correct for this condition are decelerating to a slow or developing a large rate of sink, which is difficult to control and may result in a settle below the glide slope. Accidents can occur when an aviator fails to correct for the high or high and fast early in the approach. He either remains high all the way with a greater sink rate at touchdown and a possible bolter, or he settles below the glide slope in close to at the ramp and winds up in a ramp strike. If your approach is low, add power to decrease the rate of descent. As you approach optimum glide slope, reduce power to prevent the aircraft from climbing through the glide slope. Then follow through with an intermediate power correction to maintain the centered ball. In a low and slow condition, your primary concern is to fly the aircraft back to optimum glide slope. This requires a large power addition. When a positive rate of climb is achieved, the attitude of the aircraft is lowered to obtain optimum angle of attack. Approaching optimum glide slope, a rather large power reduction is necessary to prevent the aircraft from climbing through the glide slope or accelerating. An intermediate power addition is required to stabilize the aircraft on the glide slope and prevent another settle. The most obvious accident that can occur when settling below the glide slope is a liquid landing. If the pilot doesn't get as low as the water, he might still hit the ramp. More subtle problems arise on the secondary correction off the low. The pilot gets up to optimum glide slope, but fails to maintain it and settles to a low again. More often, the pilot climbs through the glide slope, flies over the top, and bolters. Corrections in close are very difficult. The primary complication is that as the aircraft gets closer to the deck, the space within the glide slope beam for making corrections gets smaller and smaller. The pilot is faced with getting over the ramp and not passing through the glide slope to a bolter. A related problem is the settle in the middle. This situation is especially common at night when depth perception is almost non-existent. This lack of depth perception can cause a mild case of vertigo, a feeling that the aircraft is too high. If the pilot looks only at the deck, the optimum glide slope appears to be too high at night. So he must believe in the meatball and fight his urge to make the deck look right. The situation is extremely critical in approaches where the pilot breaks out at or close to minimums. When he breaks out, it's only natural for him to want to look at the deck. If he doesn't concentrate on the meatball, he will pull power off thinking he is high. At minimums, there is very little time for corrections. Pilots who get aboard regularly on the first pass at night are firm believers in the reliability of the meatball. An obvious concern in a carrier approach is lineup. It is important to establish lineup early in the approach. Late lineup corrections can cause glide slope problems. Remember, the ship is moving, so your point of reference is constantly moving to your right. This point of reference is the intersection formed by the straight deck and the angled deck. For normal winds down the angled deck, pointing your nose toward this intersection will provide you with sufficient crab to keep lined up.
So although that film was produced in the early 1960s, the techniques described there also applied to the carrier pilots I flew with in the 80s and the 90s. And they're also the ones I used to stay off the ramp when flying the Tomcat or Hornet in DCS. But since my Navy fighter squadron days, the introduction of one system over all the other technological improvements to carrier-based airplanes has significantly reduced pilot workload and made landing on the boat safer, and that's Precision Landing Mode, better known by the acronym PLM. In a recent episode recorded live at the Sea Air Space Convention just outside of Washington, D.C., former Hornet pilot D.W. Kinley gives a basic summary of what PLM is and what it does.
What we did with what is now called Precision Landing Modes, what we called at the time Magic Carpet, was we changed the way airplanes work in the groove. So when an airplane rolls wings level at that 18-second groove length, when we were kids, when you manipulate the longitudinal stick, you're moving the tail, you're changing the AOA of the airplane. Yeah, that's how you are affecting where you are on glide slope. Every airplane that's ever designed ever since the Wright brothers, that's how they control pitch. That is not how PLM airplanes control pitch. What they're doing, when you move longitudinal stick in PLM, in path or in rate, you're changing the camber of the wing. So your longitudinal stick doesn't move the tail. It changes the leading edge and trailing edge flaps. If you look at an airplane in the groove, the nose doesn't move at all.
Right.
The AOA stays constant.
So to put a finer point on what DW said there with respect to the 60s era training film guidance, a modern Super Hornet, Growler, or F35C pilot doesn't have to move the throttles or adjust the airplane's attitude when correcting glide slope during a carrier approach. All he has to do is point the flight path indicator where he wants the jet to touch down on the flight deck, and PLM will adjust the rest accordingly. And while on board the USS Harry S. Truman at sea a few weeks ago, I had the chance to ask the Carrier Air Wing 1 commander, Captain Keds Converse, a guy who started flying Hornets before they had PLM, his thoughts about what the system has done to change the carrier landing equation.
Precision landing mode is a absolute game changer. From my time, 24 years in, 22 years of flying F-18s, it's probably the biggest technological advance in terms of impact to flight operations that I've seen. It doesn't make it easy, it just makes it less difficult to land on the ship. Much more predictable, a lot fewer changes that you have to make with the stick, and the throttles are all auto throttle, so that kind of takes that out of the equation as well. And it is a big difference maker from a boarding rate standpoint especially.
Is it, like you just said, just your left hand is sort of out of the equation to some degree? Is that what makes it easier in the Super Hornet?
Yeah, so the left hand, you have auto throttle, so you have your hand resting on the throttles just in case, but really the flight control system is integrated with the throttles, and a lot of the changes that are happening in terms of maintaining glide slope is a combination of power on, power off, but it's also manipulating the flight controls and specifically the flaps to increase or decrease lift nearly instantaneously.
So not so much meatball lineup angle attack anymore? Are you just sort of looking at, I know you don't want to deviate.
I got to be careful in
basics.
case any of my junior aviators watch this.
No.
But you still absolutely have to scan, especially lineup, and when the deck's moving, which you guys missed a little bit of some sportier
last week.
Weather. Last week we had some pretty high winds and some deck movement. So yeah, looking long for lineup, making sure you're not staring at the landing area where the ship is doing this, and the ball is maybe not keeping up with the swing of the deck. So, but again, PLM is really nice to just fly a much more predictable aircraft for paddles or our landing signals officers back there keeping us safe.
As CAD Converse said there, it doesn't make it easy, it just makes it less difficult. That sums it up nicely. Landing aboard the boat remains one of the most challenging things a military pilot can attempt, and just like back in my day, only the best make it far enough to get the chance to do it. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.